I've always believed that one of the most useful things a coach can offer students is a broad picture, a general synopsis that the student is working towards. Let's take our time now to look at the front headlock and guillotine system and paint a broad step-by-step picture which shows it as a system. There are 4 essential and sequential skills to the front headlock system. The first is obviously to secure the front headlock itself. Let's divide our methods of doing so into proactive methods and reactive methods. Proactive methods, as the name implies, are those where I initiate the action. The most common form of proactive entry is some form of snap down, where I deliberately maneuver my opponent's head down to the mat, and it's me who's initiating the action. There's something aggressive and proactive about this, hence the name. The second family of entries into the front headlock are the so-called reactive methods, where my opponent initiates the action. Usually the most common form is some kind of leg takedown, double leg, single leg, high crotch, etc., etc. Anything where my opponent engages in a movement where his head becomes lower than my elbow, that's a time where I can use one of these reactive methods to enter into a front headlock. Always note that you will be required to show competence in both standing and ground positions. On the ground, you'll need to show competence with front headlock entries from both top and bottom positions. The second step in the front headlock system is to establish complete control over your opponent's head and shoulders. Now, when I say establish complete control, let's be very clear about this. The front headlock is a very controlling position when done well, but it's not controlling in the same sense that, say, for example, the back position or the mount position is. You can't completely shut down movement with it. After all, you are only controlling the head and shoulders. The rest of the body can move pretty freely. So when we talk about control, what we really want to do is get 3 points of control. These are the chin, the elbow, and the back of my opponent's head. These 3 points of control offer the single best means by which we can overcome the 2 central problems of the front headlock system. The first is the so-called distance problem. My opponent can rush towards me. As he pushes in towards me, problems start to develop. He can also back away from me in a straight line. Here too, if my opponent succeeds in creating too much distance between myself and him, it can definitely cause problems for control. The distance problem is, of course, a linear problem. It's forwards and backwards. If he comes too close, it's problematic. If he backs too far away, that's problematic. So the first thing that our 3 points of control should establish is some kind of control over distance. The second problem is the alignment problem. This is not a linear problem, but a circular one. Your opponent can circle to an advantageous angle while you're trying to hold and control him in a front headlock. If he or she can succeed in doing this, they can easily use simple methods of escaping front headlocks, arm drags, peek outs, etc., etc. So it's very important I keep my opponent directly in front of me, aligned with my body. So there we have the 2 central problems of the front headlock, the distance problem and the alignment problem. Establishing the 3 points of control at elbow, chin, and the back of the neck is a great initial way to overcome these 2 problems. The third step in our approach to the front headlock position is to create an immediate submission threat. This is where the front headlock system that we espouse is quite different from those you will find in, say, for example, the sport of wrestling. In the sport of wrestling, obviously submission holds are highly illegal, and in the sport of jiu-jitsu, they're highly encouraged. So this is one very clear means by which you can see the difference between a jiu-jitsu based approach to the front headlock versus a wrestling based approach. We take this very, very seriously. The third step is the most distinctive step in our front headlock system. It's to create this immediate submission threat, which will elicit strong defensive reactions in your opponent, which you as an athlete must learn to feed off so you can become very, very effective and very dangerous in this position overall. The means that we use to create this immediate submission threat is the so-called high-wrist position. If we can get our wrist high over our training partner's clavicle, you will immediately create a strong threat of strangulation. One of the great advantages of the high wrist position is it does something unique in the sport of jiu-jitsu. It unites the guillotine family of submissions. Traditionally, most athletes tend to specialize in one kind of guillotine or another. So for example, you'll see an athlete with an outstanding high elbow guillotine. You'll see another athlete with an outstanding arm-in guillotine, another with a great low elbow guillotine. But you almost never see an athlete who is good at all of them. Usually the picture is one where one athlete will espouse their particular guillotine as the best kind and the others as substandard or problematic. Once you start to become familiar with the high wrist position, you will see that almost all of the guillotines become equally effective, and you will be able to pick and choose which guillotine you wish to use based upon the situation in which you find yourself. And so there's a definite sense in which the high wrist position plays an incredible unifying role for the guillotine family of submissions overall. If we find for whatever reason we're unable to work with the high wrist position, unable to attain it, then we'll work with low wrist guillotines, and we'll spend considerable amounts of time in this video looking at those options. Once we've established that immediate threat of submission holds in the form of a strong strangle attack, that's where things start to become interesting. And we go now to step 4. Your opponent will always have to react to the threat of the strangulation. If he doesn't, obviously the match is over. You can expect very, very strong forms of resistance at this point. Now, the forms of resistance usually form into very predictable patterns. Usually, the resistance comes at some kind of control of your hands and wrist, some kind of positioning of the elbow, or some kind of positional move where they try to stand up, circle out, back away, etc., etc. Whenever we see people go to control our hands, our typical response is some form of go behind, where we switch to a positional attack. So we started with a strong submission threat, and then we make the transition to a positional threat. If we see our opponent's elbow as being positioned to stop guillotines, that's a clear signal that we switch to another form of submission hold. Our favorite is the katagatame variations. We specialize in the use of the so-called da strangle, or inverted katagatame as we call it, the anaconda strangle, or front katagatame as we call it, and the use of the so-called seated katagatame. We'll be looking at all three in the course of this video. And of course, there's the option your opponent has to stand up and get away from the front headlock overall. This will require the use of takedowns and pins. And from these situations, we often favor cradle-based attacks derived from the sport of wrestling, but finishing with submission holds rather than pins. Those constitute the 4 basic steps and the essential skills of the front headlock system that we teach. It's important to note that within that overall system, there are certain core principles which give our front headlock and guillotine system a certain kind of flavor. One of the most important, and the first that we'll look at, is the advantage versus dominance principle. Even white belts in the sport of jiu-jitsu are very familiar with the idea of dominant position. It's taught from the first day you begin training. Everyone is familiar with the idea that certain positions can be construed as completely dominant. So for example, mount position, rear mount position, knee on belly, side control, these are considered dominant positions. And their dominance is reflected in the point system of jiu-jitsu, which rewards the athlete for attaining them. Now, what you find is that as you go higher and higher in the sport, it becomes harder and harder to get to and maintain a truly dominant position on your opponent. The overwhelming majority of most matches are spent in neutral positions, where neither person has yet scored a point and the athletes are seeking to work their way towards a dominant position. It's our belief that within these neutral positions, there are certain tricks, certain sub-positions, certain ways I can hold myself, grip my opponent, etc., which constitute a definite advantage. They are not dominant in the sense that the mounted position or the rear mount position is dominant, but they do confer some kind of mechanical or tactical advantage that will lead us directly to a submission hold or perhaps a truly dominant position. The front headlock is a classic example. It doesn't score any points, but it confers a massive tactical and grip advantage upon your opponent, and it leads the way into either dominant positions or submission holds. The higher you go in the sport of jiu-jitsu, the more you must be able to see this distinction between advantageous situations versus dominant situations, and learn to work your way towards these so-called advantage positions and let them be a gateway into either future submission holds or future dominant positions. The front headlock is a clear example of this. A second core principle of the front headlock and guillotine system that we teach is the so-called double closure principle. The neck houses arteries that lead to the brain. Most of these submission holds employed from front headlock position do a fine job of closing off one of the carotid arteries. Some of them do a good job of closing off two. What we're looking for is not to do a good job, but to do a great job. That's why we greatly favor the high wrist position. Anytime we attain the high wrist position, you are absolutely closing off both of your opponent's carotid arteries. It feels literally like a tourniquet around your training partner's neck. This creates unusually tight strangleholds and very, very strong defensive reactions from the very onset of your attempt at a guillotine. And as we saw earlier, those strong defensive reactions become something that we feed off in this headlock system. A third principle of the front headlock system is the so-called gateway principle. This is the idea that we have to look at the value of certain positions in the sport of grappling, the sport of jiu-jitsu, as a gateway to something else. Yes, there are positions that we truly value. The rear mount position, for example, is our favorite. Nonetheless, there are many other holds, controls, pins, which while they don't score points, are an incredible gateway to some future reward, whether it be a submission or a positional score. The front headlock is one of the very best examples of a gateway to future promises of reward. Anytime we see an opportunity, whether it be proactive or reactive, we're going to take it and either use it as a reward in itself and go directly to a submission hold out of the front headlock, or use it as a gateway to something else. Remember, sometimes the true value of a position is not the position itself, but the potential it has to function as a gateway to a future reward. Always look at the front headlock in this light. A fourth core principle that you can see working throughout our system is the so-called initial threat principle. A good part of our approach to the sport is to always, for every position we find ourselves in, to create a strong initial threat to our opponent, whether it be with leg locks, whether it be with back attacks, or in this case, front headlock and guillotine. If you can reliably create a strong initial threat in any given position that elicits big defensive reactions on the part of your opponent, you will immediately put yourself in a strong proactive frame of mind where your opponent is reacting to what you're doing. The front headlock offers an extreme example of a big initial submission threat, particularly when you become adept at the high wrist position. Once you get your opponent reacting to what you're doing, you're in the driver's seat. And from there you can follow the system through to a logical conclusion. A fifth core principle of the front headlock and guillotine system is the so-called immovable elbow principle. A general feature of the human body is that the further our elbow is away from our torso and hips, the weaker that arm becomes. So whenever we go to grip people, we should always be looking to pull our elbows back towards our torso if we wish to convey strength to our opponent. Nowhere is this more important than in your initial grips in the front headlock position. Poor elbow position is probably the single most common reason why athletes experience failure in the front headlock situation. So it's very, very important we become cognizant of the positioning of our elbows, especially in the early attempts to gain and control front headlock position. As you start your move towards submission holds, the elbow can change position. Learning to understand where your elbow should be placed relative to your hips and torso is a key element to your success with the front headlock and guillotine system. As a general rule, we start when we first get a hold of the front headlock, we focus primarily upon two elbows back towards our own hips and torso to maximize our pulling strength. Once it's time to go into a guillotine, then we have to relax the elbow and get our elbow into a good strangulation position. But ultimately, when we go to strangle, we want to return elbow to hip. Only now we'll be in a different situation, either mounted on top or in some form of guard underneath our opponent. But becoming cognizant of elbow position and understanding the difference between elbow position for control versus elbow position for submission is a big part of what will make you successful with the front headlock system. Let's add now some just general points about the front headlock system. You will notice that in comparison with other systems that I teach and espouse to my students, it looks relatively simple. It's 4 relatively simple steps, it has fewer core principles, and there's a general sense of simplicity, which makes it look overall something you could learn in less time and master with fewer words and fewer drills than you could, for example, the leg system or the back system. There's definite truth to this, and there's a reason why. Let's understand the limitations of the front headlock. As much as I like it as a position, it will never be as controlling as, say, for example, the back position. If I get someone's back and secure a full body triangle on, it's realistic to assume I could hold someone my own size and my own skill level for long periods of time. So too with leg attacks. If I get a full cross ashigurami and secure both of my training partner's legs, again, it's realistic to assume I could hold them for long periods of time. Don't just take my word for it, look at my athletes in action. You will often see them get to positions like this and pin their opponents in place for 2, 3, even 4 minutes until they get the submission hold that they want. It's not realistic to think about the front headlock in the same way. I don't care how good your front headlock is, you will not be able to hold someone your own size and your own skill level in front headlocks for minutes at a time. It's not the way the position works. The front headlock is a much more dynamic position than, say, for example, back or double trouble on the legs. The system has to reflect this. That's why it's a simpler system, because the time frame that you'll be working in is much smaller than the other systems that I teach. As a result, I deliberately kept the front headlock relatively simple. It's just straightforward realism. If you can only hold a position for 10-15 seconds at most, you don't want a long, elaborate system. You want something you can run through in the shortest possible time and get the results you're looking for. The front headlock system reflects this simple fact about the very nature of grappling, that as good as the front headlock is, it's a position where we move into and move out of. We get results and we move on, as opposed to the back system or legs, where we can spend extended periods of time controlling an opponent all the way to a finish. The very nature of the front headlock is much more in line with the idea of get to it, create reactions, and either get the finish quickly or move on to another position or submission. The overall simplicity of the front headlock system is designed to reflect this basic fact. Hi, welcome to Enter the System Front Headlock series. In this series we're going to be looking at the idea of the front headlock and its closely related attack, the guillotine strangle, and looking at their effectiveness, why we favor them so much in our approach to the sport. The guillotine has always been one of the foremost submission holds in submission grappling in mixed martial arts. I believe statistically, if you break down the stats in the UFC, it is the second most common form of submission hold. The rear naked strangle is number 1, and guillotine is number 2. And then it's a long way down to the 3, 4, and 5 spots. So these two tend to dominate the action in the sport of mixed martial arts. So too in submission grappling, the guillotine has an enormously high rate of success and has always figured prominently in no-gi grappling submission rates. So the onus is on us to become very strong in this position. All of my students are highly proficient in the front headlock, and probably the most famous instance of its use was that of Gordon Ryan in the finals of ADCC, in a gold medal winning performance, used elements of the front headlock system to take a gold medal in his weight division on one of the greatest grapplers of this generation. Gary Tonin was an outstanding grappler even when I met him, but he had one huge gap in his game, and that was he completely lacked any form of solid guillotine. And I always saw this as a weakness in his overall approach to the sport. And so there was a 4-month period where I absolutely insisted that all he worked on was front headlock and guillotine. And that paid off handsomely when he fought the talented Australian athlete Kit Dale, where he employed a beautiful high elbow guillotine for a quick finish in a submission grappling bout. In the gym, the front headlock is one of the most commonly used and successful submissions that my athletes use. But because they often get the breakthrough with back and leg attacks in international competition, the front headlock has always gotten slightly less recognition than the other systems that we employ. Don't let that distract you from the fact that we value this very, very highly indeed. And this is one system that I simply won't let my students get by without learning. They have to know this. Why? I'll demonstrate it to you right now. Whenever we get into any kind of grappling exchange in a seated position, there's always a bunch of scenarios in which I play my body relative to my opponent's body. For example, as my opponent takes a seated position in front of me, his legs are relatively close to me. Okay, and as a result, leg attacks are relatively simple for me to go into. The more my opponent retracts his legs and brings his head forward, the harder it becomes for me to go into the leg successfully. But now, as he goes in to defend his legs through posture, now suddenly the head becomes much more available to me. Okay, so I play a game between, if my opponent's legs extend, then the leg systems become very easy to employ. As the legs retract and head goes forward to defend those legs, then suddenly front headlocking becomes a lot easier. So you can see there's a sense in which we play the lower half of the body against the upper half of the body in this way. He can only defend one. He can't defend them both. Okay? As the head moves back and the legs go forward and start pushing on me, then the legs become very easy to attack. Okay? And you play these off against each other. So too with strangles from front and back. If I have an angle on my training partner, it's an easy thing from here for me to start going into to defend myself. My opponent knows what he has to do. In order to defend this angular advantage, he's got to start planting hands and turning and facing towards me. But of course, that opens up strangles from the front. And so whether it be the dichotomy between upper body and lower body, or the dichotomy between front and back, the front headlock is always there. In standing position too. If my opponent, down on two knees, goes to shoot into my legs, okay, there's always a sense in which his head is now available for attack. Okay, from here it's so easy now to go into the various front headlocks that we'll be looking at later today. If he's standing with me, it's not a difficult thing in situations like this to start bringing an opponent's head down and going into front headlock position. So wherever we are, top, bottom, standing, ground, front headlock is always one of the most readily available means of attack in the sport. That's one of the main reasons why it figures so prominently in the statistics for success with submissions. It's not just available, but it's highly effective. You all know that I strongly favor strangleholds over joint locks as a general rule. Strangleholds are no matter how intense the competition, always take their effect just by the very nature of strangles. Tough, courageous opponents can take breaks to the joints, but toughness and courage simply don't count in the case of a stranglehold. No matter how tough or courageous you are, blood doesn't get to the brain, you simply pass out. And so for these reasons, I've always put a huge emphasis on the idea of strangulation out of the front headlock position. We'll be going in a lot of detail over our approach in 4 main scenarios, looking at the details, concepts, and principles behind the front headlock position, and looking at how front headlock, in particular in the sport of submission wrestling, is quite different in important ways from other grappling styles where front headlock is also used prominently. So, for example, various styles of wrestling. In the sport of jiu-jitsu, obviously, submission is the goal. In the sport of wrestling, there's other goals like takedowns, pins, things like this, which go behind, which are the focus of front headlock position. So our front headlock, of course, we engineered specifically for the sport of submission wrestling. without any further ado, let's start getting into those details now. It's very important we understand from the start that there are two aspects to the front headlock position. Our task in this video is to master both of them, to give you the tools to be able to master both. But it's important we understand from the outset these two faces, as it were, of front headlocking. Front headlocking has, on the one hand, an aspect of control, where I look to control the movement of my opponent's body in ways that benefit me and work against his interests. And on the other hand, I want to be able to submit people from there. And how I hold the front headlock, what I do from the front headlock, the way I position my hands, my elbows, etc., will be different depending upon whether my primary interest is in controlling my opponent on the one hand or finishing him on the other. It's very, very important we understand this. Okay. In the case of front headlocking, for example, if my opponent from here, say for example, went to stand up to his feet from this position, well, from here we could, for example, use a front headlock in a control aspect, a positional aspect, say for example takedowns, where from here a simple takedown would result in a knockdown, perhaps points scored in a tournament format. That's one form of control, a positional kind of control, where we went from a neutral position to score a takedown. We could, for example, in certain kind of takedown, front headlock situation, turn our training partner down into a pin, okay? And that too would demonstrate some kind of positional control over our training partner. We could have various forms of roll throughs on our training partner, and again end up in top pinning positions. So there are ways in which we can employ a front headlock to gain some form of positional control over our training partner. How I hold myself when I'm playing that game is quite different from how I might, for example, work my way into a submission hold, where in situations like this we might sit down to our butt and work various guillotines that we're looking at later today. Whether I want to control my opponent on the one hand or submit my opponent on the other is the decision I've got to make on the spot. It's got to be a snap decision. And how I behave in a front headlock will be determined by that decision. We'll be spending a lot of time today on this juxtaposition between front headlocks as control mechanisms on the one hand, mostly positional control, and submission mechanisms on the other, because they often force us to work in very different ways from the front headlock position. The front headlock system is a scenario-based system. Unlike the other two systems we've covered so far in this series, the leg system and the back system, it's based upon 4 critical scenarios. The application area of each is significantly different from the other. As a result, the best way to study the front headlock system is exactly in those 4 separate scenarios. The actions you'll be asked to learn and employ are so different from one to the other that it's like learning 4 subsystems within an overall system. Let's look very briefly now, just what are these 4 scenarios? Well, the first one, as you probably guessed, is the standing position. Okay? From any standing situation in which I successfully bring my training partner's head down and lock some form of front headlock, this is a common area of application for the front headlock system. The second is one where my opponent is kneeling and I too am in a kneeling position. Okay, this is arguably the most common application area of the front headlock system. It's also very commonly seen in the sport of wrestling. Okay, so from here there's a whole range of techniques, strategies, tactics that we'll be looking at. The third very, very common application area or scenario in which we employ the system is one where I'm in a seated position, some form of seated guard. So say, for example, I was working from some form of seated butterfly guard, and from here we came up and locked up a front headlock in any one of its manifestations. This is also a very, very common form of front headlock scenario. This one, of course, is much more common in the sport of jiu-jitsu and almost never seen in wrestling. But this is the third of the scenarios that you'll be expected to master. The fourth, for many years, was not used much at all, but is starting to become more important now.
due to the advent of and popularity of submission wrestling. This is where we employ front headlocks as we're passing someone's guard. So let's say, for example, my opponent was in, say, for example, a seated butterfly guard. Then from a situation like this, we could snap our training partner's head down and apply some version of the front headlock from here. Okay, we can even do it in situations in half guard, where from a half guard scenario, my opponent's coming up, working towards me, and from here we go down into a front headlock type situation. Okay, so these basic 4 scenarios: the standing position, both athletes kneeling on the mat, one athlete in a seated position as the other tries to pass his guard, and the last or 4th scenario where we're trying to pass our opponent's guard, and in the midst of that guard passing we apply the front headlock. These are the 4 scenarios that we use the front headlock in the system, and which we'll be spending most of our time covering in this video series. It's time we started getting into the nuts and bolts of the front headlock system. Let's look at a foundational concept which will ring true in almost all of the front headlock scenarios, front headlock and guillotine scenarios that we look at today. This is the theory of the 3 points of control. If I have a training partner in turtle position facing me, if I go to apply a right-handed front headlock, we'll demonstrate it first with elbows off the mat, just sitting up a little so that the people can see a little more clearly, hands on the floor. From here, we need 3 specific points of control which enable me to limit my opponent's movement. Okay, the first point of control is my right shoulder. I'm performing a right-handed front headlock directly on the back of my training partner's neck. This is a very, very important point. Okay, for a right-handed front headlock, I want to physically push my right shoulder forward. I never want to have my shoulder back in a front headlock. The shoulder comes forward like I'm trying to curl the shoulder inwards. And I place my shoulder right there on the back of the neck. A very, very common error that you'll often see is people coming too far forward down the spine with their shoulder. This gives my opponent easy access to my legs, and it makes it very easy for him to turn the corner around behind my elbow and start to ruin my front headlock position. Okay? It is absolutely critical that our shoulder be well placed in the back of the neck. This is for several reasons. The first is it gives direct control of your opponent's spine and head. That's always a good thing in the sport of grappling. Secondly, it governs distance between us. Okay? If my chest is over my opponent's back, there's nothing to stop him walking forward and going into my legs and lifting and putting me down, etc., etc. Okay? What governs distance between us is my shoulder position. What prevents him coming forward into my front headlock and getting to my legs and dumping me to one side is that shoulder position like so. With no hands, when he goes to push into me now, it's the shoulder that makes it difficult for him to do so. Okay, because the shoulder is pushing down and puts weight over my opponent. The application of weight goes directly through that good shoulder position. Okay, so the weight is positioned on the head rather than the upper back, where it simply won't be effective. Okay, so that's our first point of control. Let's come back on this side. The second key element of control, if the shoulder prevents him coming forward, the obvious question is, what prevents him going backwards? Okay, that's going to be my hand position. I always want, initially at least, a hand in what we call a chin strap position, where it controls my training partner's jaw. So I control the back of the head with my training partner's with my shoulder, and the front of the head with this grip here. Okay, 5 fingers controlling my training partner's jaw, just like so. Okay, when he goes to pull away from me, it's a good, strong pulling force back. So now the right shoulder prevents him coming forwards, and the right hand makes it difficult for him to pull away from me. In this way, distance is governed by me in a forwards and backwards direction, one with the hand and one with the shoulder. It's very important we understand the postural elements here. When we use the shoulder, we have to bring the shoulder forward in this direction. When I use my cupping hand, my wrist should be well bent at 90 degrees, and critically, my elbow should be retracted back towards myself. If you just come on this side. For the right-handed front headlock, I don't want my elbow going forward. The shoulder goes forward, but the elbow is retracted back and high. The further my elbow goes forward and low, the more my opponent can gain access to my elbow, and from here start going into counters. Okay. Now when we start going into submissions, we're going to have to change our elbow position. But initially our focus is only upon controlling our opponent's movement forwards and backwards. Okay. So for now, it's all about a retracted high elbow. It's all about a 90-degree bend in our wrist, controlling the line of the jaw and the chin, and my shoulder coming forward to control my training partner and put weight directly upon the head rather than the back. So let's look at these two elements out of our 3 points of control. Off an initial start, we always want a side-on body posture. We go in, shoulder position, chin position, elbow position. When my opponent goes to push into me, the shoulder position makes it very difficult. When he goes to pull away from me, the elbow position makes it very difficult. And now we're governing distance forwards and backwards. Now we have to come to the third and one of the most important aspects of control. This is my control over my opponent's elbow. We come on this side. So we've identified 2 points of control so far: the back of the neck, our training partner's chin. The third critical point of control will be my training partner's elbow. This can be controlled with an outside front headlock, where I go wrist deep around my training partner's elbow, drawing it forward and retracting my own elbow. Or I can go inside front headlock. Again, my wrist bent 90 degrees, holding the elbow and drawing it forward. One thing remains common in both cases. My own elbow is retracted back towards my own hips, like so. So both of my elbows are tight to my rib cage. A concept we'll be coming back to again and again throughout this video is the idea of the immovable elbow. The closer my elbows are to my body, the more immovable, locked, and rigid they become. The further my elbows extend away from my body, the weaker my arms become in general. In a good tight front headlock, both of my elbows are retracted back towards my hips, where they become immovable and strong. So once again, for the right-handed front headlock, shoulder position, that's 1 point of control. Chin strap, that's a second critical point of control. And the third point of control, my opponent's elbow. If I can control these 3 points, when my opponent goes to move around, you'll have excellent control over your opponent's movement in ways which will set up both positional moves and submission. Everything has to be set up around these 3 critical points of control. This applies to the overwhelming majority of the front headlock scenarios that we'll be looking at in this video series. We just looked at the extremely important theory of 3 points of control. Those 3 points of control are what make a front headlock feel strong and robust and controlling. It's equally important, however, we understand from the other guy's perspective, what is he likely to do to undermine the strengths of our front headlock? What can he do to make my front headlock less effective? Well, there's a bunch of things he can do. And the more we know about those, the more we'll be able to shut them down from happening and be effective from the front headlock position. Let's go through this now. Just come on this side. If I have a right-handed front headlock, one of the most vulnerable points of my front headlock is my right elbow. If my opponent can control the right elbow of a right-handed front headlock, he's got an excellent chance of getting out. So if I naively give him my elbow by pushing my elbow forward like so, in this weak position, it's very easy for him to start pushing my elbow down and across my body and then circling the head out and even exposing my back and putting me in a poor position. This can be done in several ways. A very popular method, I'll actually demonstrate this for myself. A very popular method is elbow posting, where my opponent has a right-handed front headlock. From here, they reach up, they post the elbow, and they start driving the elbow forward and exposing a flank. Okay. The second way in which they can use the elbow against you is with short drag methods, where they take the left hand, pull down, and feed to the right hand, and from here drag, and again they expose a flank. Okay. This too is an effective way of our opponent using the elbow against me. A second great vulnerability of the front headlock is my wrists. For a right-handed front headlock, If my opponent can get his right hand to my wrist and get his thumb inside, that will destroy the effect of my front headlock. This right versus right situation is very good for him and very, very bad indeed for me. If he can double up and get 2-on-1, now he's got an even better chance now of circling the head out, and from here I've got a trapped hand, and now I'm potentially in trouble. Okay, so if my opponent accesses my wrist with either hand, particularly the right versus right hand, that's a serious problem. Even if my opponent gets a deep bite with the left hand, even that will subvert my ability to maintain the chin strap and be effective in this position. Okay, so if my opponent gains strong access to my wrist, that's definitely going to subvert my front headlock and make it much less effective. So those are two things right off the start I have to be careful of: my elbow and my wrist. Okay, the next big thing that I have to be very careful of is my opponent's ability to circle. The magic of a front headlock is that it governs distance forwards and backwards. So for example, we saw the 3 points of control make it very hard for my opponent to move back because I have chin strapping. My shoulder position makes it very hard for him to move forward, but there's one thing it doesn't do well. It doesn't govern circular movement very well. Okay, from the front headlock situation, if my opponent circles his hips out in this direction here, it's quite easy for him to start turning and getting a flank on me. Okay, and there's very little that the front headlock does to stop that kind of movement. That's why, from my perspective as the man employing the front headlock, it's very important we have two specific kinds of movement set up in our approach to the front headlock from the start. If I'm on two knees and my opponent is on two knees and I'm employing a front headlock with my right hand, it's wise for me to take my left knee off the mat. So I have a right-handed front headlock. From here, I should always have a situation where my opposite leg is up off the mat like so. I don't want to have two knees on the mat and my opponent circles on me. I lack the mobility now to follow him, and now he starts gaining angle on me and some kind of advantage. So if I have a right-handed front headlock, it's very much in my interests to put my body in the following posture, like so, with my left leg up, so that as my opponent begins a circular movement, I can follow the movement very, very easily. From here, start breaking him down to the mat and subverting his ability to circle around me. Exactly the same thing is true when I'm working from a seated position with a front headlock. Again, circular movement is a real problem for me as the person employing the front headlock. If I, for example, snap my training partner's head down, this is a great way for me to stop him driving forward through posture. When he drives forward, my head position makes it difficult. When he goes to pull away, my chin strap makes it difficult. But one thing I can't do is stop him jumping to the opposite side of the front headlock, and now I've got potential problems. What saves me in these situations is my capacity to keep my head over him and post a foot so that we can begin a heisting action that drops us into the same situation that we saw previously. These two body movements, come back. The first, circling with a circle. My opponent goes to circle, and I circle with him, like so, to prevent him gaining an angle until I can break him down to the mat. And in the seated position, as I bang my training partner's head down, he pops over my knee line and goes to an advantageous angle. I post so that I'm able to keep my head higher than his head. I post my foot, and in one motion, we're now able to come up and into a strong front headlock and recover against my opponent's circling motion. Okay, so those are the main vulnerabilities we see. There is a fourth one which I'll touch on briefly. This is my opponent's ability to tripod. Again, the front headlock is very, very good for stopping linear motion forwards and backwards. It's much less successful stopping circular motion, as we just saw. So we came up with those two body movements which will allow us to overcome those problems. But there is another body movement my opponent can employ. He can tripod. So if we have a front headlock down here, my opponent's knees come off the mat and he can start tripoding up. Okay, now it's hard for me to hit many of the moves we like from here. Some of the submission holds become more difficult. Many of the go-behinds into my opponent's back become more difficult. But still, there's good things we can do from this position. Okay, a simple one here, if my opponent's hands are on the floor, we'll be looking more at this later on today, is to switch from a front headlock to a front body lock, okay, or chest lock, where my hands come in. From here, I can just bring my training partner back down to 2 elbows and now go right back to the front headlock. But those are the main vulnerabilities, as it were, of the front headlock position. I'm vulnerable at the wrist, I'm vulnerable at the elbow, I'm vulnerable to circular movement, and I'm vulnerable to my opponent tripoding up and moving away through a change of level. A big part of what we look at in this video series will be addressing these commonly seen problems of movement in the front headlock scenario, learning to overcome them, take advantage of them, and hopefully prevail against them. Whenever I coach the front headlock position, I often make use of a very simple teaching device which helps people learn a little bit faster. Obviously, in any front headlock situation, I'm using two arms to control my opponent. Let's make a simple and very, very important division between what is the function of those two arms. Let's talk about a control hand and a strangle hand. Okay, my opponent's here in front of me. I want to control my opponent's movement through his elbow. That's where my control hand comes in. Whether it works from outside, whether it works from wrist deep, elbow deep, or inside, its primary function is to control the area between my opponent's shoulder and elbow. That piece of real estate is the work area, as it were, of my control hand. So again, whether I'm inside, outside, wrist deep, elbow deep, okay, that's going to be the province of the control hand or control arm. So two hands for a front headlock. One hand is going to be the control hand. The second hand is controlling, but it also has a more distinctive feature, especially when we start getting into the realm of submissions, and that's strangulation. The hand that is on my opponent's chin initially obviously can also go into various forms of stranglehold. It's going to be doing most of the work of your strangle attacks. It does have other functions, but the most important ones in the front headlock system that I teach have to do with strangulation. So I often refer to the control hand and the strangle hand. So we have a very, very clear sense of what we're trying to do here with each hand. Now, a control hand by itself is a good thing, but it's not dangerous to anyone. Okay, if I just hold onto someone's arm, no one's ever going to get finished like this. Okay, if I just have a strangle hand and I just lock up strangle hands, there's not a lot of control over my opponent here, and he can start turning the head out, grabbing my wrist, etc., and finding angles. Only when you juxtapose control and submission hand and make them work as a team are you going to maximize your effectiveness in the front headlock position. You can't just work just with strangle hands. Okay, you'll finish some people, but a lot of people are going to get away from you. You can't just work with control hands behind the arms. Okay, you'll control a lot of people for sure, but you're not going to finish anyone. I'll say it again. Only when you marry the efforts of a control hand and a strangle hand and make them work in unison are you going to get the breakthroughs that you're looking for. Now, I have control hand and strangle hand. What does my opponent have? Well, he has what we call a primary defensive hand and a secondary defensive hand, similar to the back system. If I'm employing a right-handed front headlock, the most destructive grip that my opponent can get on me is to get his right wrist inside my right wrist. This will prevent me from locking my hands, which I need to do on some kinds of finishes. It will also make it very easy for him to switch to a 2-on-1 grip on my wrist, and then from here easily clear his head out of position. It will make it very, very hard for me to adequately control the head through the use of the chin strap. It's just a very, very destructive grip for my opponent to have, and I will never tolerate this kind of grip. Okay, if my opponent starts getting this kind of grip, I will immediately switch off to something else. Okay, now a secondary defensive hand is when my opponent takes his left hand to my right wrist. Not quite as bad. I can still work with this. Okay, I can clear wrists off. I can drag past my opponent. There's things we'll be looking at later in this series. It's not as bad as the primary defensive hand, but it's still an annoyance, and it can definitely slow me down and work against my interests. But most of the time, I'm looking to create movements, and we'll be seeing exactly what these movements are as this video unfolds, to prevent my opponent accessing my right hand with his right hand, and then working around any grip that he might have of his left hand upon my right hand. So as the offensive man, I always work with the concepts of control hand and strangle hand, and he, as the defensive man, always works with the idea of primary and secondary defensive hands. How we get into the hand fight situation in front headlock will basically be a competition between my strangle and control arms versus his primary and secondary defensive hands. The front headlock system, like so many others that I teach, is a 4-step system. The first step in that system is entry. I have to be able to enter into the front headlock position. We'll be looking at various means of doing so. A big part of this video is going to be how exactly we do this. How do we get someone who doesn't want to be put in a front headlock into a controlling front headlock? The number one method that we'll be looking at is variations of snap downs. We'll be spending a lot of time on snap downs from a variety of positions, but that's always going to be our first part of the first step in the system, getting to the front headlock. Most of the time it's done by, as I said, by some form of snap down. There are other methods, but that's always step number one. Step number two is going to be gaining initial control of your opponent. Now, we've already seen the fundamentals of control, that three-point system of control, using my shoulder, hand, and control hand on my opponent's elbow. So we're controlling our opponent's elbow, neck, and chin. Between those 3 points of control, you're going to hold a lot of people very securely, long enough for you to be able to get into effective attacks. Step number 3 of the system is to negate your opponent's resistance. Okay, once you put someone in a front headlock, it's a threatening thing to your opponent. No one likes having their head controlled. Everyone, even beginner grapplers, know that's not a good thing. Experienced grapplers have a large number of highly effective methods of reducing that control and ultimately escaping. So we need to be able to negate that resistance long enough that we can go into step 4, which is to make a critical tactical decision. That is the decision as to whether or not I'm going to go in the direction of positional attacks or in the direction of submission attacks, because the two require me to act very differently. The deep point that I want you to grasp at this early stage is that you will only maximize your effectiveness with positional attacks and submission attacks if you are equally good at both. If you're all about submission, you'll catch some people, but you're going to lose a lot of people positionally. If you're all about just the positional aspects, people will clam up on you and defend, and you'll have some success with getting behind people. But only when an athlete makes a genuine threat in both directions do they become good at their preferred direction. Say, for example, my primary intention is to submit people from a front headlock. Only when I create a viable threat of positional threats do my submissions become easy. If my opponent knows I'm only about submission, he'll just defend his neck and put hands in, and only the threat of position will open him up to what I really wanted all along, which is submission holds. So too, if I really just wanted positional attacks, if he knows I just want to go behind him, he'll just put his arms out and tackle me as I try to go behind. But if he's terrified to do so because of the danger of strangulation at any given moment, the arms will come in to defend strangleholds, and suddenly it's a lot easier to go behind people. So that's step number 4, making that critical tactical decision. Should I go in the direction of position or should I go in the direction of submission? The more your opponent defends one, the more vulnerable he becomes to the other. So you must be strong at both in order to maximize your overall effectiveness in the front headlock position. So the 4 critical steps again: we've got to be able to enter successfully at will into the front headlock position. We've got to be able to exert good control over our opponent's movement right from the moment of contact. We do that through those 3 critical points of control. Then we've got to be able to shut down the usually very quickly occurring resistance. As I said, no one likes having their head controlled. We have to be able to shut down that initial line of resistance. And then once we've done so to a satisfactory degree, we've got to make the big decision: are we going in the direction of position or are we going to go in the direction of submission? It's best to be strong in both. Regardless of whether you're a positional guy or a guy who favors submissions, you're only going to maximize your effectiveness when you're very good at both.